Hey guys, Will here. So about 2 months ago now, we released a complete buyer's guide for the MOZA racing ecosystem. And I said at the time that they'd been releasing products faster than we could review them here at Boosted Media. Now, as it turned out, about a week and a half after we released that video, they got in touch with me again and said, hey, we're releasing a new 12 Newton meter direct drive wheelbase, as well as a more budget friendly wheel. Would you like to check them out? And I said, absolutely, of course, because 12 Newton meters peak force is exactly where I think the sweet spot is for sim racing. So today we're going to be taking a detailed look at the new MOZA R12 direct drive sim racing wheelbase and the new KS steering wheel. Let's get started. Okay, so to begin with today, I've got some exciting news. Today's video is sponsored by Micro Center. Now, Micro Center, if you're in the US, is well known as a mecca when it comes to gadgets and PC hardware, but they also carry an amazing and growing range of sim racing hardware. Now, this is really exciting because I know a lot of you guys complain to me a lot about the fact that there's not too many places around where you can actually get hands-on with sim racing equipment before you buy it. So that is a really exciting opportunity for those of you in the US. So they've got 25 locations across the US now, with a new store opening in Indianapolis very soon, as well as an online store which you can check out. So as an added bonus, new customers who visit the store in person can receive $25 off their first order of over $100. And in addition to sim racing gear, this month they're running a sales event on laptops with some great discounts. So check them out via the links down in the description or visit your local store today. Okay, so let's get stuck into these guys, starting with a thank you to MOZA Racing for sending across this gear for us to check out today. Now, we will be cross comparing against some other alternatives in today's video as well. So it's important that you know that all the gear that you'll see in today's video was provided to us free of charge for review purposes. Now, if you do decide you want to pick up any of the gear that you see in today's video, we do have some affiliate links in the description down below. Those are a really great way of supporting our work here at Boosted Media at no additional cost to you guys if you find what we do valuable. So we really do appreciate your support there. So let's start off now by talking about pricing. Now, there's some really good news here, particularly when it comes to the KS wheel, but we'll start off with the R12 wheelbase and then we'll move across to the wheel. So R12 wheelbase comes in at $589 US or 649 euros, 589 British pounds or 999 Australian dollars. Now, I shouldn't need to tell you guys this by now, but it definitely does pay to just shop around and make sure you're getting the best possible deal. And the video sponsor, Micro Center, do sell MOZA gear as well, so you can definitely check them out if you're in the US. Now, if you compare that to the pricing of the MOZA R9, which is a 9 Newton meter direct drive wheelbase as opposed to the 12 Newton meters we get with the R12, that comes in at $439 US or 799 Australian dollars, depending on where you purchase it. So around about $150 US more expensive if you decide to go with the R12. Now, the KS wheel, that comes in at $279 US, 309 euros, 279 British pounds, or 459 Australian dollars as listed on the MOZA website. And if you compare that to their GS wheel, which was the cheapest formula style wheel which they had available up until now, but still significantly more expensive than what we have with the KS. That guy came in at $469 US or 859 Australian dollars. So not quite double the price, but getting pretty close there. So that means if you're looking to buy the R12 wheelbase and the KS wheel, you're looking at around about 868 US, which by comparison to the Acertec La Prima bundle, that comes in at $1,050. Now, unfortunately, we don't have our hands on the La Prima gear from Acertec just yet. I've been hassling them for quite some time now to get my hands on it, but they just haven't sent it across yet. So unfortunately, I can't compare directly, but that gives you guys a really good excuse if you aren't already to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on that review when we do get our hands on it. So as you can see, the overall presentation and build quality is pretty much identical to what we had with the MOZA R9, which we've gone into a lot of detail previously here on the channel. So I'm not going to waste your time today pulling things apart, showing you how the internals look and everything. As you can see here as well, the overall form factor is very similar too. The motor itself is a little bit longer. You can see it's got a slightly longer back panel here. But then the motor stem or the shaft is actually a little bit shorter. So the overall length of the bases is pretty much identical. We'll flash some dimensions up on the screen for those of you who might be needing those to plan out your rig design. But yeah, pretty much overall the same kind of footprint as the R9, just a slightly different form factor. And if we compare to the R5, if I stack that on top as well, you can see that guy is significantly smaller. But let's get him back out of the way. One thing that I really do like about MOZA's ecosystem as well is they were smart and and borrowed, let's just say, Fanatec's bolt pattern on the bottom here as well. So this is the same bolt pattern that you have with a Club Sport Wheelbase 2.5, for example, which means that this will bolt onto pretty much any sim racing rig that is out there that has a flat panel that you can bolt to. So that is a really smart move on their part. There isn't really a standardized mounting system, unfortunately, in the sim racing space. I really feel like there should be. But yeah, you shouldn't have too many issues mounting this guy. We didn't have any dramas at all with our advanced sim racing ASR4 rig that's sitting behind me, or our Track Racer TR120 that we put this on as well. So no problems at all. Now, while we're talking about mounting, you will also notice that there's two little holes in the top here. That is for mounting the MOZA racing dashes, which we've taken a look at previously. I'll link down in the description below for the review video on those. And then if we have a look around on the back of the wheelbase, you'll actually notice there's a few additional ports from what we had on the R9 and R5. So we've got a pedal port, which is new, a dash port, which we already had, a shifter port, a handbrake port, and our emergency stop, which isn't included. That is an optional accessory, which you'll need to purchase if you want to have one of those. I do think that it's a good idea to have an emergency stop on the rig for a wheelbase of this strength. It's one of those things that you just don't need until you need. And I have been in a couple of situations with other wheelbases, not with any MOZA ones, thankfully, where I have had to make use of those. So something to consider. Now, interestingly, the MOZA CRP pedals, which are their top model at this point in time, don't actually have a RJ connection to connect directly through to the wheelbase. However, some of the cheaper bundled pedals do have that. So I don't know exactly the reason why they've included the port on this particular base where it wasn't on other ones. Maybe this is an indicator that they might be looking at getting more serious about console compatibility. Remembering, of course, that consoles do rely on everything being connected through the one USB port. You can't connect your pedals and your base separately. So that's purely just a guess on my part. I don't have any insider information there, but maybe I'm onto something. Let's see. And then flipping back around to the front again, you can see exactly the same quick release mechanism that we've had on all the MOZA bases up until this point. This is a V2 style base, so you can see the additional contact pins here. Now, one thing to note with the R12 is that this doesn't have the wireless connectivity that we saw in the previous model. So that means that this base will only be compatible with their newer wheels, like the FSR wheel and the KS wheel that we're going to look at in just a minute, as well as their V2 versions of their original wheels. So just keep that in mind. If you do have a V1 wheel from MOZA Racing, it isn't going to work with this particular wheelbase. So really the only differences here are just a slightly cleaner integration on the R12 here. You can see the whole stem and the quick release mechanism is all kind of integrated into the one assembly, whereas on the R9 you can see it's a separate plate which is just bolted into place. Doesn't make any difference in terms of functionality or flex or anything like that. You guys have heard me say a million times by now that this is my favorite quick release available on the market from an OEM. Really solid click into place, really easy to take the wheels on and off, no excessive flex or anything like that. We'll get into that when we get driving a little bit later on. And if you saw my revisit video of the CSL DD just a couple of days ago, I went through the comparison between the quick release we have here and Fanatec's QR1 quick release in a lot of detail, so you can definitely check that one out as well. So I don't think there's any need to waste any more of your time on the hardware of the wheelbases. One other thing I did notice is that they've taken away the little LED indicator light on the front of the motor, which was something that I was always a little bit cranky about with the R9 and the R5. I don't see a need to have an LED shining in your face when you already know that the wheelbase is on to tell you that it's on. Obviously, if it's functional, then it's on. So I'm glad to see that that's gone away as well. But yeah, let's move on now and take a look at the KS wheel. We've got a 300mm diameter wheel, which weighs in at 1.22 kilograms, about 400 grams lighter than the GS wheel. So that is significant. The lighter the wheel is, the more responsive it's going to feel on the wheelbase, and the stronger the force feedback's going to feel. So I tested this wheel out on my R9 base to give me a point of reference, as well as testing out the R12 with a variety of different wheels, including this one, just to feel the significance of that weight difference. And yeah, it is definitely noticeable in terms of just the fidelity and the force feedback, the fine detail, the granular detail does all feel a little bit more profound with this wheel. There's not a huge amount in it, but every little bit of weight saving definitely does help. To be honest, I would have preferred it to be 290 millimeters rather than 300. I do find it's a little bit large for formula style cars, so say your F1, F2, F3s, for example, but for GT3, GT4 style driving, 290 to 300 millimeters is pretty much ideal in my opinion. Now, this is a very subjective thing. The difference is there in a more practical sense is that the larger the diameter, the more of a dampening effect it has on the force feedback. Once again, it feels a little bit less snappy and a little bit less responsive. So for something like the GT3, GT4, the larger diameter gives you a little bit less snappiness in the car. It makes it a little bit easier, at least for me, to catch slides and things like that, whereas in a formula style car like F1, F2, F3, the larger diameter can feel a little bit clumsy when you get those quick snap oversteer moments that you need to quickly correct for. But look, this is definitely a diameter that you could get used to for any style of driving. So I certainly don't think that it's a bad design choice by any means. So in terms of the materials and construction here, we've got, what do they call these grips? They call it a injection molded TPE rubber grip. Now, I'm happy to say that although these don't have a huge amount of squish to them compared to a lot of other wheels that are more expensive, they still feel very comfortable. You can see the nice moldings here as well, which make them ergonomically very comfortable to hold onto. Fits the contours of my hands at least very, very comfortably and doesn't feel flimsy or anything like that. But what I really like about this material is it's not super sticky and tacky. It's going to be interesting to see how it lasts the test of time. I don't know whether this rubberized coating is going to wear down or what that's going to look like, but it doesn't have that tendency to pick up dirt and debris, dead skin cells off your hands and things like that. So very comfortable. I did the majority of my driving with this wheel with bare hands and felt it very comfortable to use. It was absolutely fine with gloves, of course, as well. But yeah, no complaints at all when it comes to the grips themselves. I did find that the plastic area down here does kind of get into your palms. So the palm of my hand, you can see, does actually come down to here. So if you're driving a lot, if you're doing a lot of aggressive racing, you may find that that is a bit of a friction point on your hand. You may find that you end up getting blisters just around this area down here. It wasn't a problem for me, but I do spend quite a bit of time driving. My hands are definitely sim racer hands by this point in time. So depending on your hand size and shape, you may find that to be an issue. Obviously, if you compare to something like the Is the Forte wheel, which has the open bottoms here, that's going to be putting a lot less pressure on the palms of your hands. So let's talk a little bit more now about the materials that they've used throughout this. Now, on camera, this is going to look like carbon fiber. It actually isn't. It's a carbon fiber reinforced polymer, which is basically a fancy type of plastic which uses carbon fiber strands to give it extra rigidity and strength. So there's no noticeable flex in there at all when I try to twist the wheel physically in my hands. There was a little bit of flex, you'll see when we had it up on the wheelbase, just inherent in the connection between the quick release itself and the wheel, but certainly nothing excessive, certainly nothing that you're going to notice when you're driving. So no issues there at all to report with regards to rigidity or flex. And that same carbon fiber reinforced polymer extends throughout the front plate as well as the back here too. But it does have quite a genuine carbon fiber look. I'd say to the untrained eye, you probably would think that it was carbon fiber. If we have a look at the MOZA FSR, for example, by comparison, that is genuine carbon fiber. And the main difference here visually is purely just the way it kind of refracts the light as it hits it. So yeah, it certainly does look and feel cheaper in the hands than something like the FSR or the GS wheel. But when you consider the price point, I don't think that that's anything to complain about. I think they've done a really good job at sort of nailing all the things that are important to a sim racing wheel and, you know, keeping the price down at the same time. So on that subject, let's talk a little bit more about other touch points other than the grips themselves. So all the touch points on the face of the wheel are plastic. That includes the buttons, the rotary encoders, and the little joy pads. If we flip the wheel around, we do have steel paddles here for our shifters and our analog paddles. And you can see there in the case of the shifter paddles, that is actually a nice thick anodized CNC machined aluminium housing there for the magnetic paddles. We'll talk about those in just a second too, but flipping back around here, one of the things that they call out in their marketing materials is the change of design of these buttons compared to their other wheels. So these are actually very similar to what you would find on, say, the Cube Controls F Core, for example. They've got a very short throw to them, quite a snappy feel, and yeah, it feels exactly the same as what we have on the Cube Controls F Core wheel, which costs about twice as much as what this wheel does. We do have the advantage here of backlit buttons. Those are changeable, so you can actually change the color of each individual button through 8 different colors. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get that function working. The way you're meant to do that is by pressing in both joysticks. That puts it into what they call a programming mode, and then you tap on each button to change the color, and then you hold down the 2 joysticks again to go back out of programming mode. Unfortunately, we just couldn't get that to work. It would jump straight back out of programming mode immediately, but I'm sure that's just a firmware thing that will be fixed into the future. That is one small complaint that I do have with the MOZA ecosystem, is although they are evolving their software very quickly, there do tend to be some funny little bugs like that from time to time, but we'll look at the software in more detail in just a minute for you guys to give you a better overview of what that experience is going to be like. But look, in terms of the feel of all of the buttons, again, for the price point, there's really nothing to complain about here. As I said, the buttons themselves have a really nice tactile feel, a good click to them. So there's no issues at all with or without gloves, knowing whether or not you've pressed the buttons. Still that interesting design that we've seen in previous wheels with these hat switches. So these aren't 7-way funky switches. They don't have rotary encoder functionality. It is just a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-way button, up, down, left, right, and push. But you can see, although they have an analog movement here, in terms of the software, it's actually interpreted as a digital signal. So I'm not sure what the reason is for that, but yeah, it's always been that way with MOZA wheels since day dot. So yeah, not sure what the deal is with that. We've also got a RPM LED strip along the top here as well, which is programmable in the software. I'll show you that in just a minute too. And then we've got our multi-position / rotary encoder switches on the front here as well. Again, those have got a nice tactile feel to them, a good positive click with clearly defined detents in each position. Plastic hats on those as well, of course, as we mentioned earlier. But yeah, they've got a good feel to them. And again, if we cross compare to the F core wheel, I would actually say that these feel a lot better than that does. These are quite flimsy feeling, and I called that out in my review of the F core wheel. You can hear even just on the microphone there, it's got quite a cheap kind of hollow sound to it, whereas these have got a much more cushioned, nice click into each position. And then the thumb encoders, which I'm again really happy to see on this wheel, have a really good feel to them as well. With and without gloves, once again, a good, clearly defined click in each position. So there's no question at all whether or not you've made a change to their position. So then flipping the wheel around again, let's just talk a little bit more about the quick release and the shifters. So again, I don't need to go through the quick release again. You guys have heard me say a million times by now just how good this quick release is. But you can see here just the machining quality and you know, just how nice this is. If we were to compare that to say the McLaren GT3 wheel from Fanatec, this is probably the closest comparison in terms of materials and build quality to this MOZA wheel. But we've actually upgraded this to the metal quick release, which is about $100 upgrade, but that puts the price within about $30 of what we have with this MOZA racing wheel. And even this quick release still has a little bit of play and movement in it, and it just doesn't give you the same solid experience that you get with the MOZA quick release. There's not really a whole lot more to say on that. Absolutely excellent quick release. And then with the shifters, you can see the neodymium magnets here to give us that nice magnetic clunk as we move the position. Now these paddles are a little bit on the slim side. You can see there is a little bit of wiggle and flex there. Again, not really anything to complain about at this price point, I wouldn't say. If this was a $1,000 wheel, I'd be complaining about it, but we have to put things in perspective here. I think that they're definitely stiff enough for what they are. These are using contactless Hall effect sensors too, but yeah, a good feel overall, certainly nothing to complain about. And then we do have 2 analog paddles down the bottom here as well, which we often don't see on more entry-level sim racing wheels, or we might see as a optional upgrade, for example, for many wheels. So good to see them here as well. And as you'll see in a moment when we look at the software, those can be defined as digital buttons, so DRS and overtake button, for example, or analog axes if you want to map them to, say, your throttle and your brake, or handbrake, something like that, or a dual clutch mode too. Now, another thing that I really do like about the design here as well is just listen to how quiet these shifters are. So they've actually got a little tiny rubber pad just underneath there, which stops any sort of plasticky contact there. And if we compare that to, say, the Cube Controls F core wheel, about the same there, because that is also a carbon reinforced plastic. But if we go to something like the FSR wheel, which is more metal to metal, you can hear that is a lot louder. Now that has a more kind of positive, purposeful click to it. It feels like, yeah, you've really shifted gears, but it is a lot louder in saying that as well. Now they do include some little rubber dampers, which you can install with these wheels if you wish to do so. But yeah, again, I think for the price point, they've done a really, really good job here. So the last wheel that I just wanted to quickly compare to here, just for reference, is the Fanatec Forte wheel, because again, this is a similar kind of construction when it comes to materials. As I mentioned earlier, they do also have a La Prima wheel, which unfortunately we haven't been able to have hands on yet. Now I've got to say that this wheel just does have a slightly more, I guess, premium feel in hand. The grips here are just that little bit more squishy. The rotary encoders, although we do have a lot more rotary encoders here, they actually probably are a little bit looser than what we have here. The dials themselves feel pretty much identical. And then we've got our 2 7-way funky switches here. So there is a lot more functionality on this particular wheel, but the shifters and all those little details feel pretty similar. And when you consider that this wheel is significantly more expensive before you even add the additional paddles if you want them for your bite point clutch. I've got to say, the more I cross compare the KS wheel to other available options, the better value it's seeming. So one last little detail on the wheel before we move on and take a look at the software. You may have noticed this little RJ connection on the bottom of the wheel here. Now, in their marketing material, they state that this wheel can be connected directly to your PC for use on other brand wheelbases. Obviously, you're gonna need an appropriate quick release to make that happen. But one thing that I do think needs to be clarified here is that they don't include a USB cable to connect directly to your PC. So if you do wanna use this RJ connection to connect to your PC, you are gonna need to purchase for $59 US the little MOZA Universal Hub. Now, this I've actually been using to run my FSR wheel on my SimuCube 2 base. It's got a USB-C here for auxiliary power, a USB-B for connecting to the PC, and you can connect in your MOZA pedals, your wheelbase, your wheel, your dash, your shifter, and your handbrake all in through the various different RJ connections and connect that to your PC. So that does work really, really well. I haven't had any issues with it whatsoever to speak of, but you will be up for an additional cost if you want to use this wheel with other wheelbases, so just be aware of that. So when it comes to the driving experience with the KS wheel, look, honestly, there's not really a whole lot more to say that we haven't already covered. It feels really light and responsive in your hands. It's well weighted. One thing I did notice is that when it rotates on the wheelbase, this knob isn't dead center, so it does kind of wobble from side to side, which might trigger your OCD. It did a little bit for me, but I mean, that's certainly not a complaint. It's just a little observation. And while there is a little bit more flex if you kind of twist the wheel from side to side on the quick release than what you get with the FSR or the GS wheel, for example, certainly nothing, as I said before, that is excessive or that I think you're going to notice when you're driving. So yeah, I think for the price point, it is really, really good value. So let's take a quick look now at the MOZA Pit House software, which is what you're going to be using if you buy one of these wheelbases or wheels. Now, we're not going to go through in a ton of detail today. We do have a bunch of settings guides specific to various different sim racing titles, both on this channel and on MOZA's channel. So definitely check those out. I'll put some links in the description down below for you. Those were created around the R9, but the settings are going to be pretty much the same, just fine tune and adjust to your own personal preference. So when you load up the Pit House software on the home screen, it shows you the MOZA peripherals, which are connected to your PC. So you can see our KS wheel, our R12 base, and our CR pedals, which are connected individually via USB. On the right hand side here, it's got a bunch of common sim racing and racing game titles. And you'll notice on some of these, they've got a little button that says config. So if you launch a game and you don't have any force feedback or things just aren't working, chances are clicking on that config button will do the job for you. I actually did have to do that for Dirt Rally 2. A couple of wheelbases that we reviewed in the past have required you to go in and actually edit INI files manually, but this kind of does all that for you, which is really cool. So they've just kind of tidied up all this stuff over time to make the overall user experience a lot tighter, even though it looks on face level pretty much exactly the same as it did since day dot. So we've got settings here for our maximum steering angle that adjusts the sensitivity of the wheel, or how much the rotation correlates to how much it rotates inside the game. Then we've got an adjustment here too for our overall game force feedback intensity, so you can quickly jump in and wind that up or down if you wish to do so. Now, I should also mention as well, there is a MOZA smartphone app, which you can run on a tablet or a smartphone, Android or iOS, and that allows you to make quick adjustments to these things on the fly as well without having to Alt-Tab out of your game. So that's a good alternative to the Fanatec tuning menu where you can go in and adjust settings on the wheel. They actually have a smartphone app now as well. So it's a thing that's becoming more common, but it does work very well. So we'll click down to the base settings now. You can see we've got all of our basic adjustments here under the first tab. Maximum steering angle, exactly the same as what we talked about before. Road sensitivity, game force feedback intensity, maximum wheel speed, wheel spring strength, and wheel damper. And the settings for these are going to vary depending on what sim racing title you're driving and of course what type of car you're driving as well. So if we click across then to advanced settings, this gives us some more granular level adjustment to various different things. So maximum torque output limit, if you do want to limit the maximum amount of torque that the wheelbase is able to output under say crash conditions, for example, if you've got a small child running on your sim rig, then you can limit that output. For the majority of people, I would imagine you're probably going to want to leave this at 100% all the time and then just wind up and down your game force feedback intensity to fine tune to suit your personal preference. But we're going to dive into that in a little bit more detail when we get over into some of these other tabs in just a moment. So back to advanced again, steering wheel inertia, natural inertia, and wheel friction. These all give you the sensation of the wheel actually being mechanically connected to a steering rack inside the car. So they give you the sensation of weight, inertia, and all those important things to make you feel more connected as you're driving. Speed dependent dampening, this is just going to adjust the feel of the wheel depending on the speed that you're traveling at. So this is very much a subjective thing. You can just set that to be pretty much whatever you want. And then if we go across to the next tab, force feedback effect equalizer. So this is a really cool thing that that MOZA introduced about 1.5 years ago now, and I actually really like this. I thought it might be a gimmick at first, but it's actually proven to be very powerful. So what this allows you to do is boost the gain or the overall strength of various different frequency ranges on the wheel. So you can see along the top here, it's got labels which actually explain what kinds of effects you're going to be feeling at each of the frequency ranges. So you can see if we were to boost up body bumps and 80 km/h curb effects, for example, we could bump that up all the way to 500%, and that's going to make those effects feel a lot more profound. And then we go up through the range here, all the way up to, say, 60 kilometers now in sand. So that's a really sort of fine texture kind of feeling. So we're going from 0 hertz here, or the first adjustment's at 10 hertz, all the way through to 100 hertz. And that gives us a nice way of being able to boost up some of those more granular details in road textures, curbs, and so forth, without becoming overpowering when it comes to things like bumping up over curbs, banging up against other cars, and effects like those. So this does work very well, and it's definitely something that I would say is worth spending the time to fine tune and just kind of figure out what feels best to you guys, basically. And then a brand new setting, which we've only seen added just recently in the MOZA Pit House software, is this base force feedback curve. Now this kind of plays in with what we were talking about before, with the difference between capping the maximum output of the motor and adjusting the force feedback intensity as it pertains to the signal that's coming out of the game. So what this allows us to do is make adjustments to the overall dynamic range and how that's being utilized by the wheelbase. So when we have a linear output, what that means is that weaker effects, so things like textures in the road, small little bumps, things like that, are going to be proportionally weaker than, say, bumping up against a wall or something like that. So what I would recommend doing generally with this wheelbase is adjust your force feedback output so that the maximum amount of strength available is the maximum that you're ever going to want to feel. So if you're crashing into a wall, obviously you don't want to have it be so strong that it's going to break your arms or rip the wheel out of your hands or something like that. So set that to a reasonable level for your own personal physical strength. And then what you can do is, if you find that the smaller effects like rumble strips and road textures are too weak, you can actually set a different type of curve here to account for that. So along the bottom axis here, we have the force feedback signals as they're actually coming out of the game. And then up on the left-hand side here, as we go up the scale, these are what you're actually going to feel through the direct drive motor. So say, for example, we want to double the overall strength of those weaker signals. What we could do is, say, bump that up to 40, for example, and then that's going to mean that those weaker signals are going to be amplified without increasing the overall gain level. And you can play around with this as well in conjunction with the force feedback effects equalizer. So say, for example, even though you've tweaked and adjusted this to the maximum available adjustment, you're still finding that, say, ripple strips are too powerful, for example, and they're just overpowering, they're making you lose control. Then what you could do is you could find the output level where that's taking place, and then attenuate that or bring the level down, and that's going to kind of just bring everything in line. So look, for a 12 Newton meter wheelbase like this, I would imagine the majority of people are probably going to end up running a linear preset. But if you are running, say, a MOZA R5 or something like that, then this is probably going to be a little bit more useful. And if you've ever run iRacing, you'll see there's a little checkbox in the force feedback settings there for a non-linear response, which it suggests is best for weaker wheelbases. That's the reason why. It allows you to boost up those lower signals so you actually feel them through the wheel without going completely over the top with the stronger signals. So between the two of these, it does actually work really well. But for me, on the 12 Newton meter wheelbase, I did actually end up using a linear response curve here. But again, it's a very subjective thing, so it's going to be purely up to you. We've then got a miscellaneous tab here as well that just allows us to make a couple of adjustments to the feeling of the bump stops and things like that. So we then go down to the wheel settings, and this just gives us a nice graphical representation of the buttons on the wheel so we can see how they all work as they're pressed. We can adjust our different modes for our clutch paddles, for bite point, axis split, and button mode. We've then got an adjustment for the function of our rotary encoder / multi-position switches on the front of the wheel. So that allows us to operate as a multi-position switch here. You can see on the screen, it's popping up as a individually defined button for each position that the switch is in. If we go to knob mode, then it just becomes an encoder pulse in each direction. Some sim titles don't actually support multi-position switches, so it's good that they give you the option. And you can actually see there now, at the moment, that's kind of gone back in line. But if I change that to position number 4 and then allow it to go back to 0, then the next time I turn it, it's gone back to the top again. So that kind of illustrates the point that I was making there. And then basically the rest of this is all just adjustments for things like how the RPM strip across the wheel operate. This is going to change depending on the wheel that you have, of course. And then you can also make adjustments to the colors of the individual LEDs along the rev strip on this particular wheel as well. And then of course adjust the brightness or the intensity of all the LEDs around the wheel too. So pretty simple stuff. Adjustments for pedals here as well, all pretty self-explanatory. If you're not sure how to calibrate pedals, we do have a video specific to that on the channel, so check that one out. We've got our settings for dashboards here, which we've covered in previous reviews too. Other bits and pieces and accessories, shifters, handbrakes, firmware updates too. Now the firmware update process on these is pretty darn good these days. You have a one click to upgrade all button, which will just basically upgrade the firmware on any MOZA hardware that you've got connected to your PC. I have had a couple of issues a few times with some of the wheels not wanting to upgrade properly. They kind of freeze halfway through, but generally speaking, it's been pretty reliable. And if I have had a bad flash, it's been recoverable. So yeah, not too many issues there either. And then the rest of this is just settings for the software itself. And then also a support tab here where you can bring up the support website too. So that is a quick look at the MOZA Pithouse software. Again, if you are wanting more detail on individual settings for particular sim racing titles, then check out our other videos linked down in the description below for all details on that. So to establish a baseline here, I do have a lot of experience driving with the MOZA R9. So what I did with the R12 is basically just start off with exactly the same force feedback settings as I run on the R9, and then just experiment with cranking things up and down, making fine-tuning adjustments to really feel where the subtle nuances and where the differences are between the R12 and the R9 beyond just the increase in strength. Now, it's important to understand that the increase in strength alone isn't necessarily a reason to choose one base over another. What you're increasing along with that strength is also the dynamic range. That's the ability of the wheelbase to create effects within a wider range of amplitude to give you a more authentic overall feel. So you guys saw earlier when we looked at the software as well, you can really get in there and fine tune stuff to really bring out the best possible experience with these wheelbases. Now, the things that stood out to me about the R12 comparing with the R9, one of the complaints that I've had previously about MOZA wheelbases is that you do tend to need to run a little bit more filtering than with some other brands to achieve a smooth overall feel. So what I would find is I would have to run the dampening quite high, for example. And if we compare across to say the even the CSL DD, but the Acertec Invicta and Forte bases, again, we haven't tested the La Prima yet, so unfortunately I can't compare to that, but we definitely will be checking that out as soon as we possibly can. All of those bases, I find you don't need to run quite so much filtering to get that authentic feel. I found in the past with MOZA bases, if you don't have that filtering in place, they can feel just that little bit robotic in comparison to other alternatives. So testing it across other titles as well, didn't run into any compatibility issues whatsoever. In the case of Dirt Rally 2, initially when I loaded the game, there wasn't any force feedback, but I pushed that little configure button that you guys saw earlier in the software quick look, and that fixed the problem immediately, no issues beyond that. So yeah, a good overall user experience with regards to that, and a pretty consistent feel in the force feedback too. That's something that I always look for in any wheelbase, and something that has always been a strength of the Fanatec ecosystem particularly, but I would say that MOZA have definitely closed the gap with regards to that as well. Across all the sim racing titles that we tested, so ACC, Dirt Rally 2, Assetto Corsa, Automobilista 2, F1 23, pretty consistent overall force feedback feel, obviously with just the subtle nuances between the different sim titles obviously playing a part there. But it certainly didn't feel like if I jumped into a GT3 car in ACC and then in iRacing and then in AC, they didn't feel completely different to drive. The basic characteristics of the car felt very similar between them, which is something that I think is very important if you're chopping and changing between sim titles regularly. So in terms of all those little details that I look for in a direct drive wheelbase, I've got to say that I've been impressed across the board with the R12. I really didn't have anything to complain about at all when it came to the driving experience. The one thing that I did notice was when I was doing a bit of drifting in Assetto Corsa, I found a couple of times if I rotated the wheel very quickly, it would kind of feel almost disconnected just for a split second. It was almost like I was rotating the wheel too quickly. Now, I actually read through their marketing materials, and one of the things that they actually called out was that due to the response time with this particular motor that they've used here, that shouldn't be an issue. So I was surprised. I was surprised to read that. It's not an issue that I've ever had with any other MOZA wheelbase. So at this point in time, I'm just going to put it down to early firmware. I'm pretty confident that it's something that will get resolved. But look, when it comes to drifting, I don't think that you need this much power anyway. I actually found that I ended up running this at about 50 to 60% overall strength, which puts it actually below the peak strength that's available on the R9. So I'd say if you were drifting, then this probably isn't a necessary purchase anyway. You're probably better off going with an R5 or an R9 or something like a CSL DD or something that's a little bit cheaper, simply because you just don't need something this strong for drifting. But I will test this again in a couple of months' time and just see whether that issue is resolved, and I'll let you guys know down in the comments whether or not that is the case. So that's a good segue into talking about motor strength. Now, you guys have heard me say for quite some time now that, in my opinion at least, 12 to 14 Newton meters seems to be the sweet spot for peak torque. Anything more than that, and you start to get into the territory where the car's driving you rather than you driving the car, and that can feel more immersive. But in the context of sim racing, when you start to push into force feedback levels that's starting to drive you rather than you driving the car, then it does ultimately end up making you slower and less consistent around a track, regardless of the type of driving that you're doing. So of course, that is going to vary from person to person, depending on your own physical strength. But look, for me personally, I would say that the R9 was kind of teetering right on the edge of, you know, maybe wanting to look at potentially upgrading further down the path. Whenever I personally drive with the R9 after driving with my daily driver rig, which I run at 12 to 14 Newton meters, I do find it to be that little bit lacking. Whereas with the R12, I would say that if this was the only wheelbase that I owned, I would be perfectly happy, and I probably wouldn't ever feel the need to upgrade it. So, I mean, again, it is a very, very subjective thing. I can only speak from my own personal experience. I'm not the strongest guy in the world by any means, but I definitely feel like this provides enough overall force feedback strength that the majority of people would be happy with it and probably wouldn't ever feel the need to upgrade from it. So I think it's really as simple as this. If you already own, say, a CSL DD with a boost pack or maybe a MOZA R9, then it's probably a little bit of a hard sell depending on what you can get secondhand for that gear to step up to the R12. It's not an absolutely game-changing massive upgrade, although there are upgrades there in terms of the overall fidelity and of course the strength. So I think it's as simple as if you feel like what you have at the moment isn't giving you the strength and fidelity that you need, then this probably will hit the sweet spot for you, but just don't expect it to be an absolutely game-changing experience. But I'd say if you're in the market for a new direct drive wheelbase and you're looking at various different options, then this is definitely a strong contender. I would say for me personally, I would definitely spend the extra $150 to get the R12 over the R9. That little bit of extra fidelity and strength I think is worth it. But yeah, as an upgrade, probably a little bit more of a difficult sell. Now, whether or not I would recommend this over other brands at a similar kind of torque level, again, hard to say. I haven't tested out the La Prima wheelbase and wheel yet, so I can't comment on that. I can tell you that the experience with the Forte and the Invicta was really, really, really good. So the La Prima bundle is a little bit more expensive than this guy is. It's going to be a tall order to justify that additional cost, I would say, given how good the R12 is though. So I think I can say with confidence that if you buy one of these, you're certainly not going to be disappointed. I don't think that anything else is going to come out in the next year or so that is going to blow this out of the water, but you just never know what might be around the corner. There is definitely a hole in the Fanatec ecosystem at the moment around about this mark, and they have just dropped the price on the CSL DD quite significantly, which may indicate that there's something around the corner. I don't have any inside information on that, so don't read too much into what I'm saying, but I wouldn't be surprised if they did come out with something relatively soon. But as things stand right now, I have absolutely no reason not to recommend the R12. I think it does an excellent job at what it's setting out to do. No real major issues to speak of whatsoever. Build quality is all good. And yeah, I think when you consider also the fact that they're continuing to expand their ecosystem with more affordable wheels like the KS wheel as well, yeah, they're just getting stronger and stronger and stronger with every single update. And yeah, they're certainly expanding their ecosystem very, very quickly as well. So I really hope that today's video has helped you out. If it has, please do leave a thumbs up. Make sure you subscribe to the channel as well so you don't miss out on future reviews like this one. And yeah, thank you very much for watching, guys. We'll see you again very soon. Bye.